Hello there, dear listener. Welcome back to another gentle journey through the quieter, more curious corners of history. I hope you found yourself a truly comfortable position tonight. Perhaps you've adjusted your pillow to that perfect angle, pulled your softest blanket up to your chin, and settled into that drowsy state where the world feels hushed and peaceful. Let your breathing slow naturally, matching the unhurried rhythm of my voice as we embark together on a fascinating exploration of medieval life. Tonight, we're going to wander through a world that might seem both foreign and strangely familiar. A time when the very air you breathed carried stories of social order, spiritual belief, and human survival. We'll discover how something as simple as personal scent could determine your place in society, your legal standing, and in some truly remarkable cases, whether you faced public humiliation or even physical punishment. Imagine, if you will, living in a world where your personal odor wasn't just a matter of social politeness, but could actually lead to legal consequences. Picture yourself standing before a stern-faced magistrate, not because you had stolen something or committed an act of violence, but simply because the way you smelled had offended your neighbors so profoundly that they demanded justice. It sounds almost absurd to our modern sensibilities, doesn't it? Yet this was a genuine reality for countless people in medieval Europe, where the invisible boundary between personal hygiene and public order was drawn with remarkable precision and enforced with surprising vigor. The medieval world was one where smell carried meaning in ways that we can barely comprehend today. Every scent told a story of social class, of moral character, of spiritual purity or corruption, of health or disease. The air itself was believed to carry invisible threats and blessings, and the ability to control and curate the scents around you was seen as both a practical necessity and a moral imperative. Let me guide you now through the narrow, winding streets of a medieval city. Close your eyes and step with me into the year 1380, into the heart of London or Paris, or any of the great urban centers that dotted the European landscape. The morning mist is just beginning to lift from the cobblestones, and the city is awakening to another day of commerce, craft, and the endless human drama of survival. The street beneath your feet is a patchwork of stones, some fitted together with the careful precision of skilled craftsmen, others laid haphazardly by generations of repair work. The stones themselves tell stories through their surfaces, worn smooth by countless footsteps, stained by decades of spilled wine and blood and less pleasant substances. Between the stones, in the gaps and crevices, a rich mixture of mud, organic matter, and human detritus has collected over the years, creating a kind of urban soil that pulses with its own distinctive aroma. The street is barely wide enough for two people to pass each other comfortably, and when a cart needs to make its way through, pedestrians must press themselves against the walls of the buildings that line the route. These buildings rise 3 or 4 stories above you, their upper floors jutting out over the street in a way that blocks much of the natural light and creates a sense of enclosure that intensifies every sound, every smell, every sensation. The timber frames of these buildings are blackened with age and smoke, and the spaces between the wooden beams are filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks and clay that provides insulation, but also harbors moisture and, over time, develops its own complex bouquet of scents. The thatched roofs above leak occasionally, sending streams of water down the walls that carry with them the accumulated odors of straw, bird droppings, and whatever else has found its way into the thatch over the months and years. As you walk, your nose is assaulted by a symphony of smells that would overwhelm most modern people. The sharp, acrid tang of fresh horse manure mingles with the deeper, earthier scent of older animal waste that has been ground into the street surface. Horses are everywhere in this world, pulling carts, carrying riders, standing tethered outside shops and taverns, and each one contributes its own aromatic signature to the urban environment. The smell of human waste is never far away either. Most homes empty their chamber pots directly into the street, sometimes with a shouted warning of "Gardy-loo" to alert anyone who might be passing below. The waste flows in open channels down the center of the street, mixing with rainwater and refuse to create a constantly moving stream of liquid that carries with it the concentrated essence of human habitation. But these are just the background notes in a much more complex olfactory composition. From the blacksmith's forge comes the sharp smell of heated metal and coal smoke. The baker's shop contributes the warm, yeasty aroma of bread, but also the less pleasant smell of flour dust and the sweat of men working in intense heat. The butcher's stall adds the iron-rich scent of fresh blood and the sweet, slightly nauseating smell of meat that has been hanging in the warm air for longer than modern food safety standards would allow. The fishmonger's area is perhaps the most challenging to modern sensibilities. Fish that has been sitting in the sun for hours releases an odor that seems to coat the inside of your nostrils and cling to your clothing. The smell is complex, part ocean brine, part decay, part something indefinably organic that speaks to the fundamental processes of life and death that were so much more visible in medieval times than they are today. From the areas where leather workers ply their trade comes perhaps the most overwhelming smell of all. The process of turning animal hides into usable leather requires soaking the skins in vats of lime and urine, often human urine, collected specifically for this purpose. The chemical reaction that softens the hide and removes the hair creates a stench so powerful that it can be detected from considerable distances. This smell is sharp, ammonia-like, and utterly distinctive. Once you've encountered it, you'll never forget it. The dyers contribute their own chemical symphony to the urban air. The process of coloring cloth requires various substances, some mineral, some vegetable, some animal in origin. The rich red dyes might come from crushed insects, the deep blues from plants that must be fermented in special ways, the brilliant yellows from substances that release sulfurous gases as they work their chromatic magic. Each dye house has its own particular smell, and the combination of all these scents creates an ever-changing aromatic landscape that shifts with the wind and the season. In the residential areas, the situation presents its own unique challenges. Most homes lack what we would recognize as proper sanitation facilities. Human waste is collected in chamber pots, wooden buckets, or simple holes in the ground, and disposal is often haphazard. The waste from multiple families might be collected in communal pits that are cleaned out only occasionally, creating concentrated sources of smell that can dominate entire neighborhoods. The interiors of homes contribute their own scents to the overall experience. Most people burn wood or charcoal for heat and cooking, and the smoke from these fires carries with it the smell of whatever is being cooked, but also the accumulated odors of the house itself. Clothing that is rarely washed, bedding that might be changed only seasonally, rushes on the floor that serve as primitive carpeting, but also trap food scraps and other organic matter. All of these contribute to the distinctive smell that marks each household. Animals are often kept in close proximity to human habitation. Chickens might roost in the same building where people sleep, pigs might be penned just outside the door, and even larger animals like cows or horses might be stabled in structures that share walls with human dwellings. The smell of these animals, their waste, their feed, their bodies, becomes part of the daily olfactory experience of medieval urban life. Yet here's where our story begins to take a fascinating turn, one that might surprise you. Far from simply accepting these conditions as inevitable, Medieval people were acutely, intensely aware of smell and its profound implications for health, morality, and social order. They didn't just live with bad odors. They studied them, feared them, legislated against them, and yes, sometimes punished those who created them with a severity that seems almost incredible to modern minds. The medieval understanding of smell was deeply, fundamentally intertwined with their most basic theories about health, disease, and the very nature of good and evil. This wasn't simply a matter of comfort or social politeness. It was a question of survival, both physical and spiritual, that occupied some of the greatest minds of the age and influenced legal systems, medical practice, and religious doctrine. According to the prevailing medical wisdom of the time, which was based on ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been preserved and elaborated upon by Islamic scholars, the human body was governed by 4 fundamental humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humors were thought to correspond to different elements, different seasons, different emotional states, and different stages of life. When these humors existed in proper balance, a person experienced good health and moral equilibrium. When they fell out of balance, illness and spiritual corruption would inevitably follow. But here's the crucial point that medieval people understood in a way that we might find difficult to grasp. Bad smells were seen as both a symptom of humoral imbalance and a direct cause of it in others. The theory of miasma, or bad air, held that disease and moral corruption literally spread through foul-smelling vapors that could be inhaled by innocent victims. This wasn't entirely wrong from a medical standpoint. Many diseases do indeed spread through airborne particles, but medieval people extended this concept far beyond what we would consider scientifically sound. They believed that breathing in bad smells could fundamentally alter your humoral balance, making you more susceptible to disease, yes, but also more prone to sin, violence, and moral corruption. The air you breathed was thought to directly influence your spiritual state, your emotional equilibrium, and your capacity for virtuous behavior. A person who consistently exposed themselves to foul odors was not just risking their physical health, they were endangering their immortal soul. This understanding of smell as a vector for spiritual corruption was reinforced and elaborated upon by religious authorities, who saw clear connections between physical cleanliness and moral purity. From pulpits across Europe, priests and monks delivered sermons that drew explicit parallels between the cleanliness of the body and the cleanliness of the soul. Foul smells were associated with the devil and his works, while pleasant scents were connected to divine grace and spiritual purity. The very architecture of hell, as described in medieval religious texts and artistic representations, was dominated by terrible stenches. The sulfur and brimstone that were said to characterize the underworld were not just symbols, they were literal descriptions of the olfactory torments that awaited the damned. Heaven, by contrast, was portrayed as a realm of the most exquisite perfumes, where the air itself was sweet with the scent of roses and other flowers, where incense burned perpetually, and where the very breath of angels carried aromatic blessings. This religious dimension gave bad smells a moral weight that we might find difficult to understand or accept in our more secular age. A person who consistently smelled bad wasn't just unpleasant to be around. They were seen as potentially dangerous to the spiritual health of everyone in their community. Their odor was evidence of their moral failing, proof of their susceptibility to sin and corruption, and exposure to it could literally damn innocent souls. The implications of this belief system were profound and far-reaching. It meant that controlling odor wasn't just a matter of personal preference or social etiquette. It was a moral imperative that could determine your standing in both earthly and heavenly hierarchies. It also meant that communities had not just the right, but the obligation to protect themselves from the spiritual dangers posed by offensive smells. Now, you might be thinking at this point that medieval people must have been incredibly dirty, given these intense fears about smell and its moral implications. But here's where our modern assumptions about the Middle Ages begin to crumble, where the popular image of medieval people as universally unwashed and malodorous reveals itself to be largely a myth perpetrated by later centuries that wanted to emphasize their own superiority and progress. The truth is far more interesting and complex. Contrary to popular belief, bathing was not at all uncommon in medieval times. In fact, public bathhouses were a regular, prominent feature of medieval urban life, and personal cleanliness was generally valued, pursued, and achieved by most people within the constraints of their available technology and resources. In major cities like London, Paris, Nuremberg, Cologne, and dozens of others, public bathhouses known as stews operated much like modern spas or health clubs. These establishments were sophisticated operations that provided hot water, soap, towels, and sometimes even entertainment in the form of music, food, and social activities. They were not crude or primitive facilities. They were carefully designed and managed businesses that served a genuine need and commanded real respect in their communities. The bathhouses were typically heated by elaborate systems of pipes and furnaces that kept the water at comfortable temperatures. The water itself was often scented with herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint, and the soap provided was made from high-quality ingredients and often perfumed with expensive imported fragrances. Many bathhouses employed attendants who would scrub customers' backs, trim their hair, and provide various grooming services that would be familiar to anyone who has visited a modern spa. People didn't just use these bathhouses occasionally, they were part of the regular rhythm of medieval urban life. Many people maintained a routine of bathing at least once a week, often on Saturday, in preparation for Sunday church services. This Saturday bath was so common and so widely accepted that it became a recognized part of the weekly cycle, as predictable and expected as market day or the Sunday sermon. Those who could afford it might bathe more frequently, perhaps twice a week or even more, during the summer months when the risk of disease was thought to be higher. Even the poorest members of society would try to wash regularly, if not in the formal bathhouses, then in rivers, streams, public fountains, or simple wooden tubs in their homes. The idea that medieval people were indifferent to cleanliness is simply not supported by the historical evidence. The soaps available to medieval people were quite sophisticated and effective. Made from lye, derived from wood ash mixed with animal fats, these soaps created a rich lather that was genuinely effective at removing dirt and grease. The basic soap-making process was well understood and widely practiced, with different regions developing their own specialties and techniques. The wealthy could afford imported soaps from Spain, Italy, or the Middle East, which were perfumed with exotic ingredients like rose water, orange blossom, or even precious substances like ambergris. These luxury soaps were considered appropriate gifts for important occasions, and were often beautifully packaged and presented. But even ordinary people had access to locally made soaps that were scented with common herbs and were entirely adequate for maintaining personal cleanliness. Personal grooming in medieval times extended far beyond just bathing. People used combs made from bone, wood, or horn to keep their hair tidy and to remove lice and other parasites that were common in an age before effective pesticides. These combs were often beautifully carved and decorated, indicating their importance in daily life and their status as valued personal possessions. Toothpicks were another common grooming tool, made from various materials including wood, bone, and even precious metals for the wealthy. Medieval people understood the importance of dental hygiene, and tooth cleaning was a regular part of personal care routines. Some people used rough cloths to scrub their teeth, while others relied on twigs from certain trees that had natural antibacterial properties when chewed. Linen undergarments played a crucial role in medieval personal cleanliness. These body shirts were worn next to the skin and changed regularly, helping to absorb sweat and oils and keep outer clothing clean and fresh. The wealthy might have several sets of linen undergarments, allowing them to change daily if desired, while even the poor tried to maintain at least one clean set for special occasions like church services or important social events. Many people carried small sachets of herbs to provide pleasant scents throughout the day and to ward off what they believed were the disease-carrying properties of bad odors. These sachets were filled with aromatic herbs like lavender, rosemary, mint, or thyme, and were often beautifully embroidered or decorated. They were attached to clothing, carried in pockets, or hung from belts, providing a portable source of pleasant fragrance that could compete with the less appealing scents of urban life. For those who could afford them, early forms of deodorant and antiperspirant were available and widely used. Vinegar was commonly applied to the body to cleanse the skin and neutralize odors. Alum, a mineral salt that was imported from various parts of the Mediterranean, was applied to the underarms to reduce sweating and control odor. Citrus peels were rubbed on the skin to provide fresh scents and were believed to have antibacterial properties. Various herbal preparations were used for similar purposes. Mixtures of herbs, oils, and other substances were prepared by apothecaries and sold as deodorants, skin treatments, and perfumes. These preparations were often quite expensive, but they were considered essential for anyone who wanted to maintain their social standing and avoid the moral and physical dangers associated with bad odors. The wealthy had access to even more elaborate personal care products and services. Imported soaps from distant lands, perfumes made from rare ingredients, and personal servants who were skilled in the arts of grooming and hygiene were all available to those who could afford them. Private bathhouses in wealthy homes were not uncommon, and some nobles maintained elaborate facilities that rivaled the best public establishments. But then, in the year 1348, everything changed. The Black Death, that terrible plague that swept across Europe like a dark tide, killed roughly 1/3 of the population and fundamentally altered how people thought about health, disease, cleanliness, and the very nature of life itself. The plague seemed to strike randomly, affecting clean and dirty alike, rich and poor, young and old, holy and sinful, without regard for any of the traditional markers that people had believed would protect them from disease and death. This randomness was profoundly disturbing to medieval people who had built their entire understanding of health and morality on the belief that cleanliness and virtue provided protection against disease and corruption. When the plague struck down abbots who had devoted their lives to spiritual purity alongside prostitutes who lived in filth, when it killed babies who had never been exposed to any form of corruption alongside elderly sinners who had lived lives of moral compromise, the entire framework of medieval understanding began to crumble. In the panic and confusion that followed, authorities began to view the traditional practices of cleanliness and bathing with suspicion and fear. The prevailing medical wisdom, as interpreted by the physicians and scholars who survived the plague, now held that bathing opened the pores of the skin, making people more susceptible to the poisonous airs that were thought to carry the plague. The very practices that had once been seen as protective were now viewed as dangerous. Public bathhouses, which had been centers of community life and social interaction, were suddenly seen as places of contagion and danger. The close quarters, the shared water, the mixing of different social classes, all of these aspects of bathhouse culture that had once been viewed positively were now seen as creating opportunities for disease transmission. Authorities began shuttering bathhouses, and people were advised to avoid washing their bodies too frequently or too thoroughly. This shift in thinking didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't universal or immediate. Different regions and different social classes adapted to the new understanding at different rates. But it marked the beginning of a period when personal cleanliness became more complicated, more regulated, and more dangerous than it had ever been before. The fear of plague-carrying odors led to a completely new set of laws and regulations designed to control smell in public spaces. These laws were unlike anything that had existed before. They were more comprehensive, more detailed, and more harshly enforced than previous attempts to regulate public behavior. The stakes were now understood to be not just social harmony or commercial success, but the very survival of entire communities. Municipal authorities across Europe began enacting what we might call stench laws, ordinances specifically designed to identify, control, and punish offensive odors in urban areas. These laws were remarkably detailed and covered everything from large-scale industrial processes to the most intimate aspects of personal hygiene. They represented a new understanding of the relationship between individual behavior and community welfare, and they were enforced with a seriousness that reflected the life and death stakes involved. The London Assize of Nuisance, established in 1345 just before the plague but expanded and strengthened afterward, was one of the most comprehensive of these regulatory frameworks. It required that noxious trades like tanning, dyeing, metalworking, and soap making be moved outside the city walls, or at least relocated to areas where they would have minimal impact on residential neighborhoods. The law recognized that certain occupations necessarily produced offensive smells, but it sought to minimize their impact on the general population and to create clear boundaries between different types of economic activity. The law was remarkably specific in its requirements. Tanners were required to process their hides in designated areas that were downwind from residential areas and equipped with drainage systems that would carry away the worst of the chemical runoff. Dyers were required to use covered vats that would minimize the release of vapors into the air. Metalworkers were required to use specific types of furnaces that would burn more cleanly and produce less smoke. But the law went beyond just regulating commercial activities. It also imposed requirements on individual property owners and residents. People were required to maintain their cesspits and ensure that they didn't overflow into public spaces. They were forbidden from throwing waste directly into the streets, and they were required to dispose of animal carcasses and other organic waste in designated areas outside the city walls. Similar laws were enacted in cities across Europe, each adapted to local conditions and concerns. In Paris, regulations prohibited fishmongers from selling fish that had been exposed to sunlight for more than a specified number of hours, and they set specific times of day after which certain types of fish could no longer be offered for sale. Butchers were required to dispose of blood and offal in designated areas and to maintain their shops and equipment in a state of cleanliness that could be inspected by city officials. Bakers were required to maintain clean ovens and workspaces, and they were forbidden from using certain types of fuel that produced excessive smoke or offensive odors. Brewers were required to dispose of their spent grains and other waste products in ways that wouldn't create public nuisances. Even seemingly minor activities like keeping chickens or pigs within the city limits were subject to detailed regulations about waste disposal and odor control. The penalties for violating these ordinances were serious and escalating. A first offense might result in a fine that was manageable for most people, but repeated violations could lead to increasingly severe punishments that could devastate a person's economic and social standing. The progression was usually systematic and predictable: fine, increased fine, public shaming, and then physical punishment. But the enforcement of these laws was not uniform or predictable. Much depended on the social standing of the accused, the political connections they might have, the current mood of the authorities, and the specific circumstances of the violation. A wealthy merchant who violated odor regulations might be able to resolve the matter with a substantial fine and a promise to relocate his business, while a poor craftsman might find himself facing much more severe consequences for a similar offense. For those who couldn't or wouldn't pay their fines, or who repeatedly violated the stench laws despite warnings and previous penalties, more physical and humiliating punishments awaited. This is where our story takes a darker and more dramatic turn, as the line between civil infraction and criminal behavior began to blur in ways that reflected the genuine fear and desperation of communities struggling to survive in a dangerous world. The progression from fine to physical punishment was usually systematic and well documented. Court records from cities across Europe show that authorities were generally careful to follow established procedures and to ensure that punishments were proportionate to offenses. But the punishments themselves, when they were imposed, were designed to be both physically uncomfortable and socially humiliating in ways that would deter both the offender and others who might be tempted to violate community standards. The pillory was perhaps the most common form of physical punishment for smell-related offenses. This device consisted of a wooden framework erected in the most public part of town, usually the market square or in front of the church, where the maximum number of people would be forced to witness the offender's humiliation. The pillory itself was a wooden board with holes cut out for the head and hands, forcing the offender to stand in a bent-over position while secured in place by heavy wooden restraints. The physical discomfort of the pillory was considerable. Standing bent over for hours in a fixed position caused severe back pain, muscle cramps, and general exhaustion. The holes were often sized to be uncomfortably tight, restricting blood flow and causing swelling and numbness. The offender was completely helpless, unable to protect themselves from the weather, from insects, or from anything that spectators might choose to throw at them. But the physical discomfort was only part of the punishment. A sign would be hung around the offender's neck, often reading something like "Stinking Offender," "Disturber of the Peace through Foul Odors," or "Enemy of Clean Air." These signs were designed to be both humiliating and educational, making clear to observers exactly what offense had been committed and reinforcing community standards about acceptable behavior. The social humiliation was intended to be as much a part of the punishment as the physical discomfort. The offender would be displayed in the most public part of town during the busiest times of day, often during market days when crowds were largest and most diverse. This public shaming served multiple purposes. It punished the individual. It deterred others who might be tempted to violate community standards. And it allowed the community to express its collective disapproval of behavior that threatened public health and social order. Records from cities like York, Lubeck, Cologne, and Norwich show that people were indeed pilloried for offenses specifically related to smell and cleanliness. A tanner who continued to process hides too close to residential areas, despite warnings and fines, might find himself locked in the pillory for 6 or 8 hours, while townspeople gathered to express their displeasure. A dyer whose workshop produced particularly offensive chemical odors might face similar treatment, especially if he had ignored previous orders to modify his processes or relocate his business. The experience of being pilloried was described by those who witnessed it as both pathetic and terrifying. The offender would often be pelted with rotten vegetables, animal droppings, and other foul substances that added to their humiliation while also reinforcing the connection between their punishment and the offense of creating bad smells. Children were sometimes encouraged to throw things at pilloried offenders as a way of teaching them about community standards and the consequences of violating them. But the pillory was not the only form of public humiliation available to medieval authorities. In some cases, more elaborate and symbolically appropriate punishments were devised to fit the specific nature of the offense. The cucking stool, traditionally used for punishing bakers who sold underweight bread and brewers who watered down their ale, was sometimes adapted for use against those whose personal hygiene or business practices offended the community. The cucking stool was a chair-like device that could be attached to a long wooden beam, creating a kind of seesaw that allowed the offender to be dunked repeatedly in a pond, river, or public fountain. The dunking was both physically uncomfortable and symbolically appropriate for dealing with cleanliness-related offenses. The cold water was thought to shock the offender into better behavior, while the public nature of the punishment reinforced community standards and provided a form of entertainment for spectators. The device was particularly popular for dealing with what medieval law referred to as common scolds people, usually women, whose behavior was seen as disruptive to community harmony. Smell-related charges were often combined with accusations of scolding, creating a legal framework that allowed authorities to punish people whose mere presence was seen as offensive to community standards. The ducking process was carefully regulated and supervised. The offender would be strapped into the chair and then dunked a specific number of times, usually 3 or 5, with brief intervals between each dunking to allow them to catch their breath. The water was supposed to be deep enough to provide a genuine soaking, but not so deep as to cause drowning. Officials would supervise the process to ensure that it didn't get out of hand, though accidents and injuries were not uncommon. The symbolic aspects of the ducking were as important as the physical punishment. Water was associated with purification and cleansing, so the dunking was seen as a form of forced purification that would cleanse the offender of their offensive qualities. The public nature of the punishment allowed the community to participate in this purification process, symbolically washing away the contamination that the offender had brought into their midst. But now we must address the more serious and disturbing question of actual torture and extreme physical punishment. While the threat of severe punishment was real and ever-present, and while some people did face genuinely harsh treatment for smell-related offenses, the kind of systematic torture that our title suggests was relatively rare and usually involved circumstances that went far beyond simple bad smell. The medieval justice system, for all its harshness by modern standards, was also surprisingly regulated and procedural. Torture was not applied randomly or casually. It was a legal process that required specific justifications and followed established procedures. The use of torture was typically reserved for serious crimes like heresy, treason, or major theft, and it required the approval of higher authorities who were careful to ensure that proper procedures were followed. There are documented cases of more severe punishments being applied to those whose offensive trades or personal habits repeatedly disrupted community life. But these cases usually involved aggravating factors that elevated the offense beyond simple smell. A tanner who repeatedly violated orders to move his operation away from residential areas might face severe punishment, But this was typically because his defiance was seen as a challenge to legitimate authority, rather than simply because of the smell itself. The strappato, a form of torture involving hanging someone by their arms tied behind their back, was occasionally used for serious or repeated offenses related to public nuisance. The procedure was agonizing. The victim's arms were tied behind their back, and they were then hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists, causing intense pain and often permanent damage to the shoulders and arms. But even when the strappato was used for smell-related offenses, it was typically in cases where the offender had been found guilty of additional crimes or had shown persistent defiance of court orders. A dyer who had been repeatedly fined and warned about his offensive processes might face the strappato if he also was found guilty of adulterating his products or cheating his customers. A tanner might face severe punishment if his violation of odor regulations was combined with evidence that he had been stealing hides or using fraudulent practices. Whipping was more common than torture devices like the strappato, but it too was typically reserved for cases that involved more than just smell. A public whipping might be ordered for someone who had been found guilty of multiple violations of public order, including, but not limited to, offensive odors. The whipping would take place in public, often in the same market square where the pillory was located, and it would be carried out by official executioners who were skilled in administering punishment that was painful but not fatal. The reality is that most people who ran afoul of smell-related laws faced fines, public shaming, or relatively minor physical punishments like the pillory or ducking stool. The threat of more severe consequences served as a deterrent and reinforced the seriousness with which communities viewed these offenses. But actual torture was rare and usually involved other complicating factors like repeated defiance of authority, suspected criminal activity, or political considerations. The legal records that survive from medieval times show a justice system that was harsh, but also surprisingly rational and procedural. Judges and magistrates were generally careful to ensure that punishments were proportionate to offenses, and they were aware that excessive punishment could undermine the authority and legitimacy of the legal system itself. However, the psychological impact of these laws and punishments was profound and lasting. The knowledge that bad smells could lead to legal consequences created a culture of heightened awareness about personal hygiene and public behavior that influenced every aspect of daily life. People became extraordinarily sensitive to their own odors and those of others, and they developed elaborate strategies for managing and controlling the scents around them. This brings us to a fascinating exploration of the tools, techniques, and strategies that medieval people used to maintain their personal cleanliness and to create pleasant scents in their environment. Far from being ignorant of hygiene or indifferent to cleanliness, our ancestors had developed a sophisticated and comprehensive understanding of personal grooming that was remarkably effective given the technological and resource constraints of their time. The basic toolkit for personal hygiene included several categories of items that might seem both familiar and strange to modern eyes. Combs were among the most important and ubiquitous tools, and they were far more sophisticated than we might expect. Made from bone, wood, horn, or even ivory for the wealthy, these combs were often beautifully carved and decorated with intricate patterns, religious symbols, or personal emblems that indicated their importance in daily life. Medieval combs were typically double-sided, with coarse teeth on one side for detangling and fine teeth on the other side for detailed grooming and for removing lice, nits, and other parasites that were common in an age before effective pesticides. The finest combs had teeth so closely spaced that they could remove even the smallest parasites, and they were often passed down through generations as valuable family heirlooms. The use of combs was not just practical, but also social and symbolic. Combing someone else's hair was an intimate act that indicated trust and affection, and it was often performed as part of courtship rituals or as a sign of friendship and care. The act of combing was also believed to have quasi-magical properties, with certain types of combs thought to provide protection against evil influences or to promote health and fertility. Toothpicks were another essential tool, and they were made from a wide variety of materials depending on the social status and preferences of the user. The poor might use simple wooden toothpicks carved from twigs or splinters, while the wealthy could afford elaborate toothpicks made from gold, silver, or ivory, and often decorated with precious stones or intricate engravings. Medieval people had a sophisticated understanding of dental hygiene that was based on both practical experience and medical theory. They knew that food particles trapped between teeth could cause decay and bad breath, and they developed various techniques for cleaning teeth and maintaining oral health. Some people used rough cloths or pieces of linen to scrub their teeth, while others relied on twigs from certain trees that had natural antibacterial properties when chewed. The use of herbs and spices for dental care was widespread and effective. Mint, parsley, and other aromatic herbs were chewed to freshen breath and were believed to have medicinal properties that could prevent tooth decay and gum disease. Some people prepared mixtures of herbs, salt, and other substances that were used as primitive toothpastes, and these preparations were often quite effective at cleaning teeth and maintaining oral health. Linen undergarments represented one of the most important innovations in medieval personal hygiene. These body shirts were worn next to the skin and served multiple functions. They absorbed sweat and oils. They protected outer clothing from direct contact with the body, and they could be removed and washed much more easily than the heavy woolen or leather garments that were worn over them. The importance of clean linen cannot be overstated. In a world where outer garments were expensive, difficult to clean, and often worn for months or even years without washing, the ability to change into a clean linen undergarment provided a practical solution to the problem of maintaining personal cleanliness. The wealthy might have dozens of linen shirts and could change them daily, while even the poor tried to maintain at least one clean shirt for special occasions. The washing of linen was a complex and labor-intensive process that required considerable skill and knowledge. Medieval laundresses were highly valued craftspeople who understood the delicate balance of water temperature, soap concentration, and mechanical action needed to clean delicate fabrics without damaging them. The process typically involved soaking the linen in cold water to loosen dirt and stains, then washing it in hot water with strong lye-based soaps, followed by multiple rinses to remove all traces of soap residue. The drying and finishing of linen was equally important. Clean linen was typically stretched on wooden frames or hung on lines in sunny, windy locations where it could dry quickly and naturally. Some laundresses used special techniques, like laying the linen on grass in bright sunlight, which was believed to have bleaching and purifying properties that would make the fabric whiter and cleaner. Herbal sachets and aromatic pouches played crucial roles in medieval personal hygiene and scent management. These small cloth bags were filled with dried herbs, flowers, spices, and other aromatic substances, and they were used in countless ways to create pleasant scents and ward off offensive odors. The herbs used in these sachets were chosen not just for their pleasant smells, but also for their supposed medicinal and protective properties. Lavender was perhaps the most popular herb for sachets, valued for its clean, fresh scent and its believed ability to repel insects and evil influences. Rosemary was prized for its sharp, invigorating smell and its association with memory and mental clarity. Mint provided a cool, refreshing scent that was thought to promote health and vitality. Thyme, sage, and other culinary herbs were used both for their aromatic properties and their supposed ability to purify the air and prevent disease. The preparation of herbal sachets was often a communal activity, with families and neighbors gathering to harvest herbs, dry them properly, and blend them into pleasing combinations. The knowledge of which herbs to use for different purposes was passed down through generations, and skilled herbalists could create custom blends for specific needs or preferences. These sachets were used in numerous ways throughout daily life. They were sewn into clothing, tucked into bedding, hung in rooms, carried in pockets or pouches, and even placed in storage chests to keep clothing fresh and free from insects. Wealthy people might have dozens of sachets scattered throughout their homes, creating a complex aromatic environment that could be adjusted according to season, mood, or social occasion. For those who could afford them, more elaborate forms of personal scent management were available. Early deodorants and antiperspirants, while primitive by modern standards, were surprisingly effective and widely used by people who were concerned about personal odor and social acceptance. Vinegar was one of the most common and effective substances used for personal cleansing and odor control. Applied to the skin with cloths or sponges, vinegar helped to neutralize odors, kill bacteria, and create a slightly acidic environment on the skin that was hostile to the microorganisms that cause bad smells. Different types of vinegar were used for different purposes. Wine vinegar was preferred by the wealthy for its pleasant scent, while ordinary grain vinegar was used by common people for its effectiveness and affordability. Alum, a mineral salt that was imported from various parts of the Mediterranean and Asia Minor, was highly prized for its ability to reduce sweating and control body odor. Applied as a powder or dissolved in water and applied as a wash, alum created an astringent effect that tightened the pores and reduced the production of sweat. This substance was expensive and highly valued, often traded alongside spices and other luxury goods. Citrus peels, when available, were rubbed on the skin to provide fresh, clean scents and were believed to have antibacterial properties that could prevent infection and disease. The oils in citrus peels created a pleasant fragrance that could last for hours, and the slight acidity was thought to be beneficial for skin health. Orange and lemon peels were particularly prized, though they were expensive luxuries that were available only to the wealthy or on special occasions. Various herbal preparations were created by apothecaries and skilled herbalists specifically for personal hygiene and scent management. These preparations might include complex mixtures of herbs, oils, vinegars, and other substances that were designed to address specific needs or preferences. Some were intended to be applied directly to the skin, while others were meant to be added to bath water or used to scent clothing and bedding. The wealthy had access to an even more elaborate array of personal care products and services that would not seem entirely unfamiliar to users of modern luxury spas and beauty treatments. Imported soaps from distant lands were available to those who could afford them. Spanish soaps scented with exotic flowers, Italian soaps made with fine olive oil, and even soaps from the Middle East that contained precious ingredients like rose water and exotic spices. Professional perfumers created custom fragrances for wealthy clients, blending imported oils, extracts, and aromatic substances to create unique scents that could serve as personal signatures. These perfumes were often quite expensive, with the most elaborate preparations costing as much as a skilled craftsman might earn in several months. The knowledge and skill required to create these perfumes was closely guarded, with successful perfumers enjoying high social status and considerable wealth. Personal servants skilled in the arts of grooming and hygiene were employed by the wealthiest families to ensure that their employers always appeared and smelled appropriate to their social station. These servants understood the complex requirements of different social situations and could adjust their employers' grooming and scenting routines accordingly. They knew which scents were appropriate for different occasions, how to layer different fragrances for maximum effect, and how to maintain the elaborate clothing and accessories that were required for high society appearances. Private bathhouses in wealthy homes were not uncommon, and some of these facilities rivaled the best public establishment in their sophistication and luxury. These private baths might include elaborate heating systems, multiple pools or tubs for different purposes, and dedicated spaces for grooming and relaxation. The maintenance of these facilities required considerable resources and expertise, but they provided their owners with complete control over their bathing environment and ensured privacy for activities that were becoming increasingly sensitive due to changing attitudes about the body and cleanliness. Perfume and incense played absolutely crucial roles in medieval life, serving functions that went far beyond simple personal preference or luxury. These aromatic substances were deeply embedded in the religious, social, and medical practices of the time, and their use was governed by complex rules and traditions that reflected their importance in daily life. Churches burned frankincense, myrrh, and other precious aromatic substances during religious services, creating powerful associations between pleasant smells and spiritual purity, divine favor, and moral righteousness. The smoke from these incenses was believed to carry prayers directly to heaven, while the scents themselves were thought to purify the air and create an environment that was conducive to worship and spiritual contemplation. The use of incense in religious contexts was carefully regulated and highly ritualized. Different types of incense were burned at different times and for different purposes: frankincense for major feast days, myrrh for funeral services, and various other aromatic substances for specific saints' days and liturgical seasons. The preparation and burning of incense was often the responsibility of specially trained clergy who understood the symbolic and practical aspects of these aromatic rituals. This religious use of scent reinforced and amplified the general cultural belief that good smells were morally superior to bad ones, and it created a framework within which personal scenting practices could be understood and evaluated. A person who smelled like the incense used in church was symbolically associated with holiness and righteousness, while someone who smelled of less pleasant substances was implicitly connected with sin and moral corruption. Nobles and wealthy merchants carried pomanders, small perforated containers filled with aromatic substances that provided a portable source of pleasant scent throughout the day. These devices were often made from precious metals like gold or silver and decorated with jewels, intricate engravings, or religious symbols that indicated their importance and value. The pomanders themselves became fashion accessories that could indicate social status, wealth, and sophisticated taste. The contents of pomanders were carefully chosen and frequently changed to provide different scents for different occasions and seasons. Common fillings included ground spices like cinnamon and cloves, dried flowers like rose petals and lavender, aromatic resins like benzoin and storax, and even exotic substances like ambergris and musk that were imported from distant parts of the world at considerable expense. The use of pomanders was governed by subtle social rules that indicated when and how they should be displayed and used. Different scents were considered appropriate for different social situations: light, floral scents for informal occasions, richer, spicier scents for formal events, and particular combinations that were associated with specific seasons or religious observances. The guild system that governed medieval crafts included detailed and comprehensive regulations for apothecaries who made perfumes, rose water, and other scented products. These regulations were designed to ensure quality, prevent adulteration, and maintain the reputation of the craft. But they also reflected the genuine importance of these products in daily life and their significant economic value. Master apothecaries who specialized in aromatic products were highly skilled craftspeople who understood the complex chemistry of scent creation and the subtle art of blending different aromatic substances to create pleasing and effective combinations. Their workshops were filled with exotic ingredients imported from around the world, and their knowledge of these substances and their properties was based on centuries of accumulated experience and experimentation. The training required to become a master perfumer or aromatic specialist was extensive and expensive. Apprentices might spend 7 years or more learning the trade, starting with basic tasks like grinding spices and cleaning equipment, and gradually working their way up to more complex responsibilities like blending fragrances and dealing with customers. The knowledge required included not just practical skills, but also understanding of medical theory, religious symbolism, and social customs that governed the use of different scents. Even ordinary people who couldn't afford professional perfumes or elaborate pomanders had access to natural sources of pleasant scents that could be incorporated into their daily lives. Gardens, both private and communal, often included sections devoted to aromatic herbs and flowers that could be harvested and used for personal care and home scenting. Lavender, rosemary, mint, thyme, and dozens of other herbs were commonly grown in medieval gardens, and the knowledge of how to cultivate, harvest, and use these plants was widespread throughout the population. These herbs served multiple purposes. They could be used for cooking, for medicine, for personal care, and for creating pleasant scents in homes and on clothing. Wildflowers and aromatic plants were also gathered from fields, forests, and wastelands for use in personal care and home scenting. The knowledge of which plants were safe and effective for different purposes was passed down through generations, and skilled herbalists could identify dozens of useful aromatic plants and knew how to prepare them for various uses. The connection between pleasant smells and health was so strong in medieval thinking that many people believed that exposure to good scents could actually prevent disease and promote physical and spiritual well-being. This belief led to the widespread use of aromatic substances not just for personal pleasure, but as a form of preventive medicine that was taken very seriously by both medical authorities and ordinary people. Religious communities developed their own distinctive approaches to cleanliness and scent that reflected their particular theological and practical concerns. The Benedictine rule, which governed hundreds of monasteries across Europe, included specific and detailed directives about personal hygiene that were designed to balance the need for cleanliness with the requirements of monastic discipline and the limitations of monastic resources. According to the Benedictine rule, monks were required to wash their feet weekly, typically on Saturday in preparation for Sunday worship, and to bathe their entire bodies quarterly, usually at the beginning of each season. These requirements might seem minimal by modern standards, but they represented a significant commitment of time and resources in a world where water had to be heated by hand and soap was expensive and difficult to obtain. The weekly foot washing was not just a matter of personal hygiene, but also a religious ritual that recalled Christ's washing of his disciples' feet and symbolized the humility and service that were central to monastic life. The quarterly baths were often communal activities that reinforced the bonds of community life while also serving practical hygiene needs. Monastic communities often maintained extensive herb gardens where they grew medicinal and aromatic plants that were used not just by the monks themselves, but also by the surrounding lay community. These gardens were centers of botanical knowledge and experimentation, where monks developed new techniques for cultivating, processing, and using aromatic and medicinal plants. The knowledge of herbal medicine and aromatics that developed in monasteries was carefully preserved in written texts that were copied and shared between different religious communities. These texts included detailed information about which plants were useful for different purposes, how to prepare them properly, and how to use them safely and effectively. Much of our knowledge about medieval herbalism and aromatics comes from these monastic sources. The emphasis on cleanliness in religious communities wasn't just practical, but also deeply spiritual and symbolic. Clean bodies were seen as more appropriate vessels for pure souls, and the discipline required to maintain personal cleanliness, despite the challenges and limitations of monastic life, was viewed as a form of spiritual exercise that developed character and demonstrated commitment to religious ideals. The differences between rural and urban experiences of smell and cleanliness were quite pronounced and reflected the different challenges and opportunities that characterized these different ways of life. In the countryside, people had much easier access to clean water from streams, rivers, and springs, and they could bathe more freely without the constraints of urban regulations or the limitations of shared facilities. Rural bathing often took place in natural bodies of water streams, ponds, or rivers that provided abundant clean water and natural settings that were private and pleasant. Country people could bathe as frequently as they wished without worrying about the cost of heating water or the availability of bathhouse facilities. They could also dispose of wastewater and other byproducts of bathing without creating the kinds of problems that plagued urban communities. However, rural people also lived in much closer proximity to farm animals and agricultural processes that created their own distinctive and often powerful odors. The smell of cow dung, horse manure, pig waste, and chicken droppings was a constant presence in agricultural communities, creating an olfactory environment that was fundamentally different from urban areas. But here's the interesting thing: these agricultural smells were generally accepted as a natural and necessary part of farming life rather than being viewed as offensive or dangerous. Manure was associated with fertility and prosperity rather than with moral corruption or health risks. The smell of healthy animals and well-maintained farms was actually seen as positive, indicating successful agricultural management and economic prosperity. Rural people developed different strategies for managing personal cleanliness that took advantage of their natural environment while also addressing the particular challenges of agricultural life. They might bathe more frequently than their urban counterparts, but they also had to deal with the reality that their work brought them into daily contact with substances that could quickly undo the effects of careful grooming. Urban smells, by contrast, were more concentrated, more artificial, and often more immediately threatening to health and social order. The chemical odors from dyeing and tanning operations, the concentrated waste from dense populations, and the smells from various crafts and trades created an olfactory environment that was both more intense and more problematic than what existed in rural areas. City dwellers had access to professional services and facilities that weren't available in rural areas: public bathhouses, professional laundresses, apothecaries who could provide specialized personal care products, and craftspeople who could create custom solutions for individual hygiene needs. But they also faced much greater restrictions on their behavior and much more intensive regulation of their personal habits and business practices. The close quarters of urban living meant that individual choices about cleanliness and scent had much more significant impacts on other people. A single household that failed to maintain proper hygiene standards could affect an entire neighborhood, while a business that produced offensive odors could disrupt the lives and livelihoods of dozens or even hundreds of people. This created a dynamic tension between individual freedom and community welfare that was much less pronounced in rural areas where people had more space and more privacy. Urban communities developed more detailed and more strictly enforced standards for personal and commercial behavior, and they created legal and social mechanisms for dealing with violations that were more formal and more punitive than anything that existed in the countryside. The gendered aspects of medieval attitudes toward smell and cleanliness reveal fascinating and complex tensions that reflected broader anxieties about gender, sexuality, and social order. Women were often held to higher standards of personal cleanliness than men, but they were also viewed with suspicion and sometimes hostility when they gathered in the spaces where cleanliness was maintained and social networks were formed. Women's bathhouses were important centers of social interaction where news was shared, business was conducted, friendships were maintained, and information was exchanged. These spaces provided women with opportunities for conversation and community that were not available in other aspects of medieval life, where women's activities were often more restricted and more closely supervised. However, these gatherings were also viewed with considerable suspicion by male authorities who worried about what women might be discussing, planning, or teaching each other in these relatively private and unsupervised settings. The social aspects of women's bathing were seen as potentially subversive and dangerous, even while cleanliness itself was valued and encouraged. Religious authorities sometimes included references to what they called the stench of Eve in their sermons, connecting women's bodies with sin, corruption, and moral weakness in ways that were not typically applied to men. These attitudes created complex and contradictory expectations for women who were expected to maintain higher standards of cleanliness and appearance, while also being viewed as inherently more associated with bodily corruption and moral failing. Women were often seen as being more susceptible to the moral dangers associated with bad smells, but they were also expected to be more skilled at creating and maintaining pleasant scents. This double standard reflected broader cultural anxieties about women's roles and capabilities, and it created additional pressures and expectations that affected how women approached personal hygiene and scent management. Midwives and other women involved in medical care often developed particular expertise in the use of aromatic herbs and substances in their professional work. Lavender water was commonly used during childbirth both for its pleasant scent and its supposed healing and calming properties. Rose water was used for various medical treatments, and other aromatic substances were incorporated into traditional women's medicine in ways that gave women specialized knowledge about scents and their effects. These practices gave women particular authority and expertise in matters of scent and cleanliness, but they also sometimes brought them into conflict with male medical authorities who were suspicious of traditional women's knowledge and practices. The tension between traditional women's medicine and emerging professional medical practice was often played out in debates about the proper use of aromatic substances and their effects on health and morality. Women's clothing and personal accessories often incorporated aromatic elements in ways that were both practical and symbolic. Sachets of herbs were sewn into dresses and undergarments. Aromatic oils were applied to jewelry and hair ornaments, and scented waters were used to launder and refresh clothing. These practices allowed women to create personal aromatic environments that could be adjusted and controlled according to their needs and preferences. The knowledge and skills required for these practices were typically passed down from mother to daughter through informal networks that preserved and transmitted traditional knowledge about herbs, scents, and personal care. This created a parallel system of expertise that existed alongside formal medical and legal authorities, but that was often more practical and more immediately relevant to daily life. Now, let's take a gentle and careful moment to separate historical fact from popular fiction and to address some of the myths and misconceptions that have grown up around medieval attitudes toward cleanliness and smell. Many of the dramatic stories you may have heard about people being tortured for smelling bad are either greatly exaggerated or completely fictional, based on misunderstandings of medieval law and society that have been perpetuated by centuries of storytelling and historical misinterpretation. The popular image of medieval people as universally dirty, smelly, and indifferent to personal hygiene is largely incorrect and unfair. While standards of cleanliness were certainly different from our own, and while some people certainly did smell bad by modern standards, the historical evidence clearly shows that the majority of medieval people made genuine and often quite successful efforts to maintain personal hygiene within the constraints of their available technology and resources. The legal punishments for smell-related offenses were real and sometimes harsh, but they were usually proportionate to the severity and persistence of the offense, and they were applied within a legal framework that included protections and procedures designed to prevent abuse. A person who occasionally smelled bad wouldn't face legal consequences, but someone whose activities or personal habits consistently and seriously disrupted community life might indeed face fines, public shaming, or other punishments. The archival records that survive from medieval times show that smell-related legal cases were actually relatively uncommon, and when they did occur, they usually involved commercial or industrial activities like tanning, dyeing, or metalworking, rather than simple personal hygiene failures. The cases that did involve personal cleanliness were often connected to other social issues like public disorder, defiance of authority, or violations of community standards that went beyond simple smell. The fear of bad smells was real and powerful in medieval society, but it was part of a broader and more nuanced understanding of health, morality, and community life than our modern stereotypes suggest. Medieval people were not primitive or ignorant. They were intelligent people trying to create healthy, harmonious communities with the knowledge and resources available to them. The legal and social mechanisms they developed for dealing with smell-related problems reflected genuine concerns about public health and social order, but they also incorporated sophisticated understanding of proportionality, due process, and community welfare that we might find surprisingly modern and reasonable. The connection between smell and moral character that was so important in medieval thinking was based on medical and religious theories that seemed logical and reasonable given the knowledge available at the time. While we now know that these theories were often incorrect, the people who believed in them were not being superstitious or irrational. They were trying to understand and respond to real challenges using the best information they had. The emphasis on community standards and collective responsibility that characterized medieval approaches to smell and cleanliness reflected social and economic realities that made individual behavior much more consequential for community welfare than it is in our more individualistic and technologically advanced society. When communities lacked modern sanitation systems, water treatment facilities, and other infrastructure, individual choices about hygiene and waste disposal really could affect the health and well-being of everyone in the area. The medieval understanding of the relationship between physical and spiritual health, while based on theories that we now know to be incorrect, reflected a holistic approach to human well-being that recognized the interconnected nature of different aspects of human experience. The idea that how we care for our bodies affects our moral and spiritual condition, while expressed in terms that seem strange to modern minds, contains insights about the relationship between self-discipline, self-respect, and character development that remain relevant today. As we reflect on this long journey through medieval attitudes toward smell, cleanliness, and social order, we might feel a profound sense of gratitude for the many conveniences and advantages of modern life that we often take for granted. The ability to turn a tap and have unlimited clean, hot water flowing into our homes is a luxury that most humans throughout history could never have imagined, let alone experienced on a daily basis. Our sophisticated sewage systems, water treatment plants, and waste management infrastructure protect us from many of the odors, health hazards, and social conflicts that our ancestors faced as routine parts of daily life. The complex networks of pipes, pumps, and treatment facilities that serve modern communities represent centuries of accumulated knowledge, technological development, and social organization that have fundamentally transformed the human experience. Modern soap, shampoo, deodorant, toothpaste, and countless other personal care products are readily available, relatively inexpensive, and remarkably effective. We can maintain levels of personal cleanliness that would have been impossible for even the wealthiest medieval nobles, and we can do so with minimal effort, expense, or time commitment. Our understanding of hygiene, disease transmission, and personal care is based on scientific knowledge of bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms that was completely unknown to medieval people. We know why certain practices are effective, how diseases actually spread, and what measures are most important for maintaining health and preventing infection. The privacy that we enjoy in matters of personal hygiene would have seemed almost unimaginable to most medieval people who lived in much closer quarters with family members, neighbors, and strangers. Our ability to bathe privately, to dispose of waste discreetly, and to manage our personal hygiene without community supervision or interference represents a level of individual autonomy that was rare and precious in earlier times. Yet perhaps there are some things we can learn from medieval attitudes toward smell, cleanliness, and community life that might be valuable for our own time and circumstances. The recognition that individual behavior affects others, that personal choices have social consequences, and that communities have both the right and the responsibility to establish standards for behavior that promote the common good. These insights remain relevant and important in our interconnected world. The medieval understanding of the connection between personal discipline and character development, while expressed in terms of humoral theory and spiritual purity that seems strange to modern minds, reflects a recognition that how we care for ourselves and present ourselves to others matters in ways that go beyond simple physical comfort or social convention. The idea that pleasant scents and clean environments contribute to social harmony, mental well-being, and community pride is one that resonates with modern urban planning, workplace design, and community development practices. The medieval recognition that our sensory environment affects our mood, behavior, and social relationships has been confirmed by modern research in environmental psychology and neuroscience. The medieval emphasis on community responsibility and collective action in matters of public health and social welfare, while sometimes carried to extremes that we would find unacceptable, reflects an understanding that some problems require coordinated community responses rather than purely individual solutions. As you prepare for sleep tonight, perhaps you might take a moment to appreciate the simple luxuries of modern cleanliness that surround you. The clean sheets against your skin, the fresh air in your room, the subtle sense of modern life that are so carefully managed and controlled that we barely notice them. These comforts represent the accumulated efforts of countless generations of people who worked to understand and improve the human condition. You might imagine the simple pleasure that a medieval person would have felt in enjoying a warm bath, the satisfaction of putting on a clean linen shirt, or the delight of carrying a small sachet of lavender that could provide pleasant scent throughout the day. These basic human desires for cleanliness, comfort, and pleasant surroundings connect us across the centuries to people who lived very different lives, but shared many of our fundamental needs and aspirations. The story of medieval attitudes towards smell and cleanliness is ultimately a story about human ingenuity, social cooperation, and the endless human effort to create better conditions for ourselves and our communities. It reminds us that the challenges we face in balancing individual freedom with community welfare, in managing shared resources, and in creating healthy environments for human flourishing are not new. They are fundamental aspects of the human condition that every generation must address in its own way. The solutions our ancestors developed were products of their time, their knowledge, and their circumstances, but the underlying challenges they faced, how to create healthy, harmonious communities where people can live together peacefully and prosperously, remain with us today. We may have better tools and more scientific knowledge, but we share their basic goals and aspirations. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, let yourself be grateful for the remarkable achievements that have given you the comfort and security you enjoy, but also appreciate the courage, creativity, and determination with which our ancestors approached the challenges of their time. They may not have had our scientific understanding or our technological resources, but they shared our basic human desire to create pleasant, healthy environments for themselves and their families. Sleep well, dear listener, in your clean, comfortable bed, in your well-ventilated room, surrounded by the carefully managed scents and sounds of modern life. Rest peacefully, knowing that you live in a time when the fear of being punished for smelling bad is nothing more than a curious historical footnote, a reminder of how different life once was and how far we have come in our understanding of health, hygiene, and human dignity. Let your breathing slow naturally, let your muscles relax completely, and let the gentle lessons of history fade gradually into dreams. Tomorrow you will wake refreshed, clean, and free from the peculiar anxieties that once troubled our ancestors. Until then, sleep deeply and dream sweetly of times both different and similar to our own, when the scent of lavender and the warmth of clean water were precious luxuries, much as they remain today, and when people much like ourselves worked to create better lives for themselves and their communities. Rest now, and good night.